Welcome to tonight's show, a conversation with Frederick Douglass, part of a series of Looking for Lincoln conversations. Join us for a conversation with Frederick Douglass regarding advocating for the creation of the U.S. colored troops to fight in the Civil War for the abolishment of slavery. The presentation will include excerpts from speeches by Frederick Douglass. Douglass is portrayed this evening by Bob Davis. For more information about Looking for Lincoln conversations, visit the Looking for Lincoln Facebook page. This program is funded by Illinois Humanities. It is now my pleasure to introduce Frederick Douglass.
Good evening. As an abolitionist, I advocated aggressively for the colored men to fight in the Civil War, stating repeatedly that a war undertaken and brazenly carried on by the rebellious slaveholders for the perpetual enslavement of colored men calls logically and loudly for colored men to help suppress it. Tonight, I will highlight excerpts from 4 of my speeches and excerpts from President Lincoln's Proclamation of Emancipation. Taken together, they provide insights into my thinking and illustrates the importance that Black men play a decisive role in the destruction of slavery and their fight for freedom. But first, let me share some important facts about my life. I was born a slave in February 1818 near Tuckahoe in Talbot County, Maryland, and grew up largely without my immediate family. I remember seeing my mother only a handful of times. She was a slave, and my father, a white man unknown to me. At the age of 6, my grandmother, a midwife, took me to the slave quarters. There, I saw one of my aunts being whipped severely by the plantation overseer. He beat her, whipped her until her back was bloody. He whipped to make her scream and whipped to make her hush. It was a blood-stained gate, the entrance to the hell of slavery. At the age of 11, Sophia Ott, whom I later served as houseboy, taught me the alphabet. But when she mentioned teaching me to read the Bible, my master, her husband, Hugh Ott, made her stop because it was illegal in the slave state of Maryland to teach a slave to read. I began to realize that if it is illegal to teach slaves to read, then it must be important for slaves to learn to read. Realizing that reading was important, I bartered with some poor white boys in my Baltimore neighborhood, trading food, bread, and sandwiches for their knowledge. At the age of 16, already demonstrating my independent spirit, I was sent to toil on the farm of the slave breaker Ed Covey. To break my spirit, Covey would beat me severely for no apparent reason, cutting my back and causing blood to run and ridges on my flesh as large as my baby finger. Finally, after multiple beatings, I rebelled and turned on Covey, fighting back, hitting and beating him in a vicious fight. From that fight, I experienced the emotional impact of fighting back, a lesson I would later share while recruiting colored men to fight in the Civil War. I escaped from slavery in 1838 at the age of 20. I posed as a free Black sailor, wearing a sailor's uniform made in secret by Anna Murray, seamstress and free Black woman soon to be my wife. I boarded a train carrying false credentials, bound for ships to Philadelphia. When the conductor asked to see my freedom papers, I responded, "Yes, sir, I have a paper with the American eagle on it that will carry me around the world." Still, I was petrified as I handed the document to the conductor. The conductor reviewed the document, then handed it back to me without comment. Eventually, arriving in New York City, I was joined by Anna Murray and Mary. We ultimately settled in New Bedford, Massachusetts, where I found work in the shipyards. Shortly after settling in New Bedford, I met with William Lloyd Garrison, abolitionist, journalist, suffragist, and social reformer, while attending an anti-slavery convention on August 11, 1841 at Nantucket. and joined the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. There, I began to work as an abolitionist, speaking and writing and exposing the evils of slavery, and arguing that slavery was contrary to the moral and political values of the United States. I became a prominent public speaker and spoke so elegantly that some refused to believe that I was an escaped slave. Thus, at a meeting, I exposed my back bearing the scars of a slave driver's lash, then wrote one of my 3 autobiographies exposing myself to the slave catchers. To avoid re-enslavement, I escaped to Europe in 1845 at the age of 27. Supported and protected by friends, I lived, traveled, and spoke at political, social, and religious gatherings in Britain, Ireland, and Scotland for a period of 2 years. About that time, my friends and admirers raised funds and purchased my freedom, allowing me to return to the United States and my family a free man. Over the years, I became one of the most famous intellectuals, black or white, advising presidents and lecturing to thousands, covering a range of causes, including women's rights and the Irish Home Rule. I authored 3 autobiographies, including one of the best writers, and became one of the best writers of the historic period. Thus, I was much sought after to speak on the raging topics of the era, mainly the slaveholders in rebellion against the Union and the need for Black men to fight in the Civil War. The question is, who were the rebellious slaveholders? They were mainly Southern planters who relied totally on slave labor for their enormous economic growth, profits, and way of life. With cash crops of tobacco, cotton, and sugarcane, America's southern states became the economic engine of the growing nation. The slaveholders used their enormous wealth to justify the enslavement of colored people and to justify and support the economic engine of slavery. To keep it that way, they would, and they did, rebel and fight against the Union, thus starting the Civil War. Now, I will share with you excerpts from my speeches, which were delivered at different times to sway public policy and opinion, leading up to and during the Civil War. The excerpts will help you to visualize the progression of events as I saw them at specific points in time. I delivered the first speech entitled The Slaveholders' Rebellion on July the 4th, 1862. Some thought it was a stinging criticism of President Lincoln. But little did I know at the time that President Lincoln was contemplating a proclamation of emancipation, and that he would sign into law just 2 weeks after my speech, a powerful emancipation measure, the Second Confiscation Act, on July 17, 1862. Note that this new act empowered the president to use emancipated slaves and free men in the Union Army in any capacity, including battle. The speech. I come now to the policy of President Lincoln regarding slavery. What has been the tendency of his action since he became Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy? I do not hesitate to say that whatever has been his intentions, the actions of President Lincoln have been calculated in a marked and decided way to shield and protect slavery from the various blows from which its horrible crimes may have loudly and persistently invited. He has scornfully rejected the policy of arming the slaves, a policy naturally suggested and enforced by the nature and necessities of the war. He has steadily refused to proclaim, as he has the constitutional and moral right to proclaim, complete emancipation of all slaves or rebels who should make their way into the lines of the army. He has repeatedly interfered with and arrested or halted the anti-slavery policy of some of his most earnest and reliable generals. He has assigned the most important positions to generals who are notoriously pro-slavery and hostile to the party and principles which raised him to power. He has permitted the rebels to recapture their runaway slaves in sight of the nation's capital. And he has, evidently from the first, submitted himself to the guidance of the half-loyal slave states rather than the wise and loyal suggestions from those states upon which must fall and have fallen the chief expense and danger involved in the prosecution of the war. It is from such action that we must infer the policy of the administration. To my mind, that policy is simply and solely to reconstruct the Union on the cold and corrupting basis of compromise, by which slavery or the slave states shall retain all the power it has ever had with the full assurance of gaining more. The question now arises, is such a reconstruction now possible or desirable? To this, I answer from the depths of my soul, no. Mr. Lincoln is powerful. Mr. Lincoln can do many things, but Mr. Lincoln will never see the day when he can bring back or charm back the scattered fragments of the Union into the shape and form they stood when they were shattered by this slaveholding rebellion. You must abolish slavery or abandon the Union. It is plain that there can never be any union between the North and the South, while the South values slavery more than nationality. A union of interests is essential to a union of ideas, and without this union of ideas, the outward form of the union will be but a rope of sand. But it is asking, how will you abolish slavery? You have no power over the system before the rebellion is suppressed, and you will have no right or power when it is suppressed. I will answer this argument when I have stated how the thing will be done. The fact is, there will be no trouble about the way, if only the government possessed the will. But several ways have been suggested. One is a stringent confiscation bill from Congress. Another is a proclamation by the president at the head of the nation. Another is by the commanders of each division of the Army. There is plausibility in the argument that we cannot reach slavery until we have suppressed the rebellion. Yet, it is far truer to say that we cannot reach the rebellion until we have suppressed slavery. For slavery is the life of the rebellion. I am convinced that this Confederate rebellion and slavery are twin monsters, and that they must flourish together. But a proclamation of emancipation, says one, would only be a paper order. All loans and all written rules for the government and the army and the navy and people are paper orders and would remain such were they not backed up by force. Still, we do not object to them as useless, but admit their wisdom and necessity. Then these orders will carry with them a certain moral force, which makes them, in large measure, self-executing. I know of none which would possess this self-executing power in larger measure than a proclamation of emancipation. Speech. President Lincoln, true to his word, as stated in the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, issued September the 22nd, 1862, said that if the rebels did not end the fighting and rejoin the Union by January the 1st, 1863, all slaves in the rebellious states would be free. Thus, when the first day of January 1863 arrived, and the slaveholding states had not ceased their rebellion against the Union, President Lincoln reaffirmed his decision, and in the final proclamation opened the door to the abolishment of slavery within the states or parts of states still in rebellion against the Union. He stated that on the first day of January in the year of our Lord, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of the state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. In addition, the final proclamation included two significant changes from the preliminary proclamation. One, it contained no provisions for colonization, and two, it called for the recruitment of Black men into the Union Army and Navy. Thus, the destination or the destiny of the American nation would be changed forever in the direction of expanded freedom and liberty. Now note the change in tone during my next speech, entitled Emancipation Proclaimed, as I responded to President Lincoln's proclamation dated September the 22nd, 1862. Common sense, the necessities of war, to say nothing of the dictation of justice and humanity, have at last prevailed. We shout for joy that we live to record this righteous decree. Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, in his own peculiar, cautious, forbearing, hesitating, and slow way, but we hope sure, has, while the loyal heart was near beating with despair, proclaimed and declared that on the 1st of January in the year of our Lord, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or any designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be thenceforward and forever free. Forever free? President Lincoln has embraced in his proclamation the law of Congress passed more than 6 months ago, prohibiting the employment of any part of the Army and Naval Forces of the United States to return fugitive slaves to their masters, and commanded all officers of the Army and Navy to respect and obey its provisions. He has still further declared his intention to urge upon the legislature of all the slave states not in rebellion, the immediate or gradual abolition of slavery. But read the proclamation, for it is the most important of any to which the President of the United States has ever signed his name. Opinions will widely differ as to the practical effects of the Emancipation Proclamation on the war. All those classes at the North who have lost their affection for slavery will regard the measure as the very worst measure that could be devised. All their plans for the future have been projected with a view to a reconstruction of the American government upon the basis of compromise between slaveholding and non-slaveholding states. The thought of a country unified in sentiments, objects, and ideas has not entered into their political calculations, and hence, newly declared policy of the government, which contemplates one glorious homogeneous people, doing away at a blow with the whole class of compromisers and corruptors, will meet their stern opposition. Will that opposition prevail? Will it lead President Lincoln to reconsider and retract? Not a word of it. President Lincoln may be slow, but President Abraham Lincoln is not the man to reconsider, retract, and contradict words and purposes solemnly proclaimed over his official signature. No, Abraham Lincoln will take no step backwards. His word has gone out over the country and the world, giving joy and gladness to the friends of freedom and progress, wherever those words are read, and he will stand by them and carry them out to the letter. If he has taught us to confide in nothing else, President Lincoln has taught us to confide in his word. 3 points from the final Emancipation document needs restating. First, President Lincoln put the Confederacy on notice that there would be no compromise over the abolition or the end of slavery. Second, the final proclamation had an unexpected clause. Lincoln invited colored freemen and freedmen, whom he would later refer to as his colored warriors, to join that Civil War fight. Third, clearly, President Lincoln and I saw the Emancipation Proclamation as cracking open the door to freedom and liberty, letting the Black man rush through in his quest to help destroy slavery. Recruiting and enlisting Black men to fight in the Civil War became a primary cause of mine. On March the 2nd, 1863, I delivered a recruitment speech entitled Men of Color to Arms. The speech was published later that same month in my newsletter, Douglass's Monthly, as Black men enlisting in the Union Army and Navy responded to my rallying cry. I reprinted or spoke versions of my former speech on several occasions, as I now quote. When first the rebel cannon shattered the walls of Fort Sumter, I predicted that the war, then and there inaugurated, would not be fought out entirely by white men. Every month's experience during these 2 dreary years has confirmed that opinion. A war undertaken and brazenly carried on for the perpetual enslavement of colored men, called logically and loudly for their help to suppress it. Only a moderate share of sagacity or wisdom was needed to see that the arm of the slave was the best defense against the arm of the slaveholder. Hence, with every reverse to the national arms, with every exulting shout of victory raised by the slave-holding rebels, I have implored the imperiled nation to unchain against her foes her powerful Black hand. Slowly and reluctantly, that appeal is beginning to be heeded. There is no time for delay. The tide is at its flood that leads on the fortune from east to west, from north to south. The sky is written all over, now or never. Liberty won for us by white men would lack half its luster. Who would be free themselves must strike the blow. Better even to die free than to live as slaves. This is the sentiment of every brave colored man amongst us. This emotion, this thought, reminds me of my youth as a slave when, in 1833, I spent a year on the farm of the slave breaker Ed Covey. The frequent whippings broke my body, soul, and spirit. Yet, I finally rebelled against the beatings, fought back, and won the fight. After I won the physical confrontation, Ed Covey never tried to beat me again. President Lincoln, the abolitionist movement, and I, plus the lovers of freedom and liberty, were supportive of the critical to the Black man's participation and success in the Civil War. During the Civil War, approximately 210,000 colored soldiers and sailors fought under our American flag for union and freedom. They fought for the destruction of slavery and for what President Lincoln termed the nation's new birth of freedom. As part of this clause, approximately 450,000 slaves aided the Union efforts, serving as spies and guides and nurses, building roads and fortifications, and helping lost, wounded, and helpless Union soldiers, Black and white, to their lines, escaping those deadly Southern prisons. We thank God for the white officers who fought and sacrificed with the colored soldiers. These soldiers, these freedom fighters, whom President Lincoln later referred to as his colored or Black warriors, formed 175 infantry, cavalry, heavy, and light artillery regiments. They fought in 449 separate engagements, of which 41 were major battles. They served in every military theater in the East, the West, the Mississippi Valley, and in the Trans-Mississippi. They entered combat in early 1862 and continued fighting until May 12, 1865 at Palmetto Ranch, Texas. Nearly 40,000 gave their lives for the expanded cause of freedom. They were fighting not only for the abolishment of slavery, but for the full rights of citizenship in our land, which ultimately includes the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution. In conclusion, a closing comment about President Abraham Lincoln, followed by a closing comment about Frederick Douglass. The name of Abraham Lincoln was near and dear to our hearts in the darkest and most perilous hours of the Republic. But our faith was often taxed and strained to the utmost. I certainly did not agree with or even understand many of his decisions, and I spoke up when I thought he was wrong. For early on, we had different agendas. I sought to free a people. He had to lead a nation. Friends, I hope so, for he was a great and noble man who loathed and hated slavery and led a grateful nation through a tumultuous period. Infinite wisdom has seldom sent a man better suited for that mission. This is the president's walking stick that Mary Lincoln sent me after the president's assassination. She said, Mr. Lincoln had always wanted me to have it, a final gift from a friend. Who was Frederick Douglass? K.A. Sy would say he was a Black man, chiseled by adversity, discrimination, and slavery. He was defined and enhanced by political astuteness and polished and buffeted by self-education and life's experiences. He emerged in crystallized form, not as a diamond in the rough, but as a brilliant jewel of Black manhood, draped in brotherhood and motivated to the achievement and abolishment of slavery and the expansion of freedom and liberty as expressed in the preamble to the Declaration of Independence and inherited in the United States Constitution, bearing the belief that all people are born with the unalienable rights of freedom and liberty. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now it's your turn, our audience who's been listening, to submit your questions and Frederick Douglass will answer them. So if you're not familiar with how to do that, just type your questions in the comments and we will get through as many of them as time allows. All right, so here is our first question. Why did Frederick Douglass feel that learning to read was so important as a slave?
Well, learning to read opened a whole new world for him, or would open a whole new world for him. Because the thing is, like reading the Bible, there are a lot of scripts and ideas, positive and negative, that helps one to understand what life is about and what the world is about. And furthermore, learning to read will help him as well as other slaves to understand that they are human beings the same as white men. And that being a slave is something that is not ordained by God, but it is something that is more ordained by man. And so the thing is that learning to read then introduces them to a range of concepts and ideas, a way of thinking, a way of looking at reality and seeing what's around them and interpreting what's around them. And therefore, perhaps leading to the conclusion, or not perhaps, but leading to the conclusion that there is no such thing as a slave by birth, and that freedom and liberty are options that face them as well.
Okay. Well, building off of that question, while we're waiting for some more comments to come in, Douglass said, or you said, that knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave. What did you mean by that?
It's really a different way of asking that first question as I think about it. As you acquire, and yet, let's track Frederick Douglass. As he acquired more and more and more knowledge and different experiences, then he began to see options. I mean, the whole idea of fighting back and fighting Ed Covey, for example, slaves were typically, murdered or killed for that, and were jailed, and But the thing is that he felt as though being a human being and being controlled to some extent of his destiny, then he had the right to fight back and protect himself. And so, I mean, the option pretty much was ongoing slavery and ultimately death. But it ties really back to the first question.
Okay. Thank you. So during this speech that you were talking about, the slaveholders' rebellion, you made a statement that said, power concedes nothing without a demand. How does that apply to the slaveholders' rebellion?
The slaveholders' rebellion, that whole rebellion is pretty much about that phrase. Because the thing is that the slaveholders, they wanted to retain power, to spread slavery out into the territories, for example, and to protect their the men that they have enslaved, so that they can continue to generate the profits and the enormous profits, in fact, and the wealth, and then the privilege that goes along with that. There are certain political privileges as well as economic privileges. It was a whole way of life that was actually being used to support that whole system. And the fact is that they didn't want to give that up. And that's why one of the main reasons why they rebelled and fought against the Union.
Okay.
And what's interesting there too is that if you go and check the statements that were made, there's a word that I'm looking for, that were made by the different states as they seceded from the Union. Some of the states built into their documentation that slavery was to be an ongoing privilege. And in fact, that was built into the Southern Constitution. I think it was also built into the Constitution of Mississippi and South Carolina. But you can go back and check. But that set the theme for the type of country that they wanted. And the thing is, they were prepared to fight for it. And if the North wanted to, was reluctant for slavery to expand out into the territories, better yet, if they wanted to continue the country to continue down the road to expanded freedom and liberty, then a fight had to occur, and it did occur.
Okay. All right. Well, Christine has a question for us. She's asking, when did slaves in the border states obtain their freedom? Did they have to wait until this amendment was passed?
Well, actually, when the 13th Amendment was passed, then at that point, the slaves they had their freedom. Initially, what happened was that when the Civil War broke out, and the border states decided to sit on the side, so to speak, then the retention of their slaves was not a threat. But I think but over the course of the war, then it became evident that seeing the black men out there fighting and the way in which they were helping to maintain freedom, that well, anyhow.
Okay. All right. Here's our next question. Here we go. This one is from Rose. She said, how did the relationship between Lincoln and Douglass evolve over time?
Well, initially, as we showed in the presentation tonight, then Douglass had a lot of questions about the Lincoln administration and their policies, but they came together in the Emancipation Proclamation. And then, as Douglass was out recruiting and watching the outcome of the war, then he noticed and was told how the slaves, or how the black men, both free and former slaves, how they were being mistreated. And of course, that's when he went to see Lincoln. But and Lincoln explained to him that there were some things that had to be done before he could actually make the positive steps that needed to be made to really support the black soldiers in the same way in which the white soldiers were being supported. So, but over time, anyhow, the public became more and more open to the idea of freedom, period. And with the passage of the 13th Amendment, then that's when they got their freedom at the same time as the former slaves and those who were actually living in the slave states.
Okay, thank you. All right, so here is my final question for you. Why do you think it's important to study Frederick Douglass in the 21st century? How has he impacted life today? Why is it significant?
I think that if you go back to 1776, where the whole theme was one of liberty and freedom, and then you begin to trace back, coming back to the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and then the Compromise of 1850, coming forward again to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and also to the Dred Scott decision of 1858 in the Supreme Court. You could see the conflict taking place between freedom and slavery, because in each step along the way in the United States Congress, they were debating that whole issue. And so Douglass became part of that discussion, and of course helping to explain and articulate what was occurring and a policy and strategy going forward. Then he was significant in that whole discussion and that whole debate. But I think that if you bring it up to the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and then you go beyond that, for example, even up to the Civil Rights Movement, you'll see that trend still going on. I mean, it goes back to the founding of this nation, and we're still in the process of acting out the Declaration of Independence. So that's what you see.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for speaking with us this evening. And I think it's time to say goodnight. So goodbye, everybody. Thank you for tuning into tonight's broadcast, and pay attention to Looking for Lincoln's Facebook page to find out when our next broadcast is coming. Good night.
Good night. Thank you, and good night.